Hello and welcome to Meet the Professors. I'm your host, Professor Deana Pollard Sacks, and today we're going to be talking about the effect the media has on your mind. I have two wonderful guests today. I have Victor Strasburger, who is a distinguished professor of pediatrics and the founding chief of adolescent medicine at the University of New Mexico. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I also have Ed Donnerstein, who is Dean Emeritus at the University of Arizona Department of Communications and a past president of the International Society for Research on Aggression. So my first question is, and this is a broad question, how do we learn as human beings?
By observing, by watching others. So we learn, if you think of a child, 4, 5, 6-year-old, they learn from observing their parents, they learn by observing their peers, but they also learn by something we call vicarious learning, by watching the media, which is a very strong, educational tool for children. And they learn a whole host of things. So, they learn how to count on Sesame Street. So they learn certain behaviors, and those behaviors can be stored in memory for later use. But the more interesting thing is they learn scripts about behaviors. So how do I interact with a new person I've never met? What do I do when mom and dad take me to a restaurant? And there are little scripts. But they also learn scripts about how do I behave when I'm angered or frustrated, or when I'm in a sexual type of situation. And those scripts, which come from sort of how they process the media, stay in memory from adolescence through adulthood. And in certain situations, when they're primed, which means there's something there in the environment which gets them to think about the situation, those things they've stored and learned, again, from parents, from peers, and from the media, now come out to the forefront, and they act upon them.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because when I was at Berkeley, my professor, Linda Krieger, sort of turned me on to social learning theory. I ended up doing a thesis on that. And one of the things I thought was so amazing that I didn't know until she taught me was that we're kind of almost like computers. I mean, data comes into our brain, and over time it accumulates. And when we do have these, same concepts enter our mind over and over again, over time they become implicit. And this explains stereotyping, and it also explains sort of knee-jerk reactions to people and situations. And we're being influenced basically without knowing it by data that's come into our mind. And Vic, I know you've done a lot of research on the effects of media, and you wrote the textbook, Children and Adolescents in the Media, which I've read almost cover to cover. Do you have anything to add to the learning, how children learn?
There's the social modeling, there's the role modeling that pediatricians like me all understand and know about. You've got a 3-year-old and you're trying to nail up a picture and you go, oh damn, and your 3-year-old goes around the house going, oh damn, oh damn, oh damn. That's the role modeling effect. Right. And you may role model your parents, but you also may role model someone in the media because they're attractive, they're there 24/7. If you're a teenager, there's something called the super peer theory, which is actually a theory that I developed a long time ago, which says that the media act like a super peer. I mean, we all know that teenagers are influenced by their peer group. Think of the media as a super peer. Everyone's having sex, everyone's drinking without consequences, everyone's smoking in the movies. So that exerts a certain influence on kids.
Yeah, and the other thing is, the theories that account for learning are the same whether it's pro-social or educational or negative. So none of us would ever disagree that if a child watches Sesame Street, which we all would say is incredibly educational for a young child, and one of the characters drops something and they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We all agree the child can learn that. But the child also learns how to pick up a gun and how to use it. That doesn't mean they're going to shoot it, but ask them, do they know how to pick it up, what it does, how to load it? The answer would be yes. The learning processes for all the educational pro-social, unfortunately, are no different than for some of the negative things. And that social learning, cognitive processing is exactly the same across.
Right, and it's funny you mentioned Sesame Street because I'm aware that when that was created, it was created specifically because the broadcast media knew that children are programmed through television. And this was a wonderful endeavor to help, sort of level the playing field for children who didn't have access to good education, to give them, free, well, basically free, all you had to have was a television, and then they got this great learning. And Linda Krieger's article, the first article that she referred me to, had to do with the content of our categories, and she actually quoted some of Sesame Street to explain that when we are given the same information over and over again, it accumulates in our brain, and over time, it again becomes implicit and governs us without us knowing it. And so what we get into our brains as children is particularly influential. And my understanding is after around 21, 22, 23, our brains are more solidified. And I know the fMRI studies over the last 15 years or so have really given us a window into how the adolescent mind develops. And if one of you could sort of explain what the fMRI studies have shown us in terms of what part of the brain is sort of exploding starting around age 13 and why that's so important.
Fixed-raised adolescents.
So the adolescent brain is immature. In fact, the human brain is the only animal brain that is plastic and develops in response to environmental stimuli, which again has implications for why media are so important, especially with young children, with babies. The brain is developing in response to environmental cues. If that's a screen, that's very different than if that's a parent. The adolescent brain is not fully mature until age 25, 26, 27,
Wow.
which explains why teenagers do dumb things, and that's why people like me are around to try to keep them safe and healthy as much as we can. It's the areas of the brain, the frontal cortex that deals with judgment, and parts of the amygdala towards the brainstem that deal with impulse control. So all those things that you associate with teenagers, it's not their fault, it's their brain being immature. They will eventually grow out of it if we can keep them alive until they're 25, 26, 27.
And we also have to remember, one of the things we forget is that children perceive the media differently than adolescents and adults. And it's very difficult for us as adults to put ourselves into that position. So if you're talking about a 4 or 5-year-old watching television or a film, let's say television, they have a totally different perception. They have a great deal of difficulty distinguishing fantasy from reality. So you and I would say, well, that's not real. No, elephants do fly in Dumbo, and the kids are really going to believe they fly.
With their ears.
with their ears. They're very perceptually bound. So the way something looks is what's important. So a child would get frightened at something you and I wouldn't. There's lots of research on young children being scared of the flying monkeys and the Wizard of Oz, where you and I would just sort of laugh it off. And they also have difficulty with plot. They can't link things together. And this becomes important when you think of, the topic of media violence. So you and I would say, as an adult or even an adolescent, this person committed an act of violence, and at the end of the show, they were punished. From a 4-year-old, irrelevant. It's what they did at that point in time. They can't put the plot together. They don't quite understand the consequences. So a lot of times when we think about why are children different, we've got to put ourselves into their shoes. They're looking at this thing called the screen much differently than you and I.
Right. I remember when I was researching this issue about the adolescent brain growth, and I read a book called The Primal Teen, and it was just after the fMRI studies came out, and the way I understood it was that basically right around 13, the brain starts a massive remodeling period where all the sort of things we learn as a child are all sort of being questioned. It's almost like a rope has been unfrayed, and they're all deciding how they're going to go reattach, and what goes into the brain during that period, 13 to 20 or whatnot, is incredibly influential from what I hear. That's sort of that fMRI research showing the frontal lobes just exploding, like they have the time lapse, just like, and so that's the part that affects your judgment, your executive function, your morality, and that's ironically the period of time when most kids are consuming a lot of video games, a lot of other media that may have a lot of negative messages.
And peers are very influential, and as Vic said, this sort of super peer, which is the media, plays a very, very powerful role, particularly for characters that adolescent identifies with. This is somebody I like. This is somebody I want to be like and idolize and do what they do. And it's also, there's a lot of research now on sort of these super peers in social media.
Yeah.
You know, I look at my 500 close Facebook friends, so to speak, and what's going on there. And those are strong influences. I mean, peers play a very strong role, and we know from lots of the research, whether it's violence, whether it's sex, whether it's body image, occupation, stereotypes, media is a very powerful influence at that age, very powerful.
Well, and I totally believe you because you are two of the world's leading experts in this area. But for those who don't buy it, I mean, we have research, we have a wealth of research, don't we, just demonstrating that the media is very influential. And I know that in recent years there have been certain researchers who have come forth and sort of challenged that. But let me just ask you, for the average person out there who maybe never heard of these things, how do we know the media influences us and actually builds our character without us knowing it?
First of all, kids spend an extraordinary amount of time with media. So even if you didn't believe any of the research, if you're spending 7 to 11 hours a day with a variety of different media, how can that not have an impact on you? Whether it's obesity because you're sitting inert, or it's because of the effect of advertising, or you become more aggressive. It's got to have 7 to 11 hours a day is more time than kids spend in school, more time than they spend in any other activity but sleeping. So it's got to have an effect. The research can be complicated. It can be experimental studies, it can be studies, kind of naturalistic studies, it can be what we call correlational studies that don't give you cause and effect. It can be longitudinal. And there are several longitudinal studies, the longest being Dunedin from New Zealand, where they took 1,000 babies and have followed them for 37 years. And they can show that what you watch and how much you watch as a child has a major influence on you as an adult. Now, it's not the leading influence, it's maybe 10%, but that's a nice healthy chunk that we could improve if we wanted to.
Yeah, and I think we have to keep in mind when we talk about any effects, the media is a risk factor, and we have no difficulty understanding that in the health-related research. So, what leads to heart disease? Well, I smoke. I have high cholesterol. My dad had heart disease. I'm sedentary. I'm overweight. I don't exercise. All of those are risk factors for heart disease. Doesn't mean you're going to get a heart attack.
Right.
But the more and more of those you have, the greater the likelihood. And that's where the media plays its role. Not that if you watch an aggressive film, you're all of a sudden going to act aggressively. But if you've been a victim of aggression, you belong to a gang, you have drugs, you see lots of violence in your community, you see lots of violence in the media. Does it predict a greater likelihood of acting aggressively? Yes.
And lots
It
and
plays
lots
a
of
role.
studies have shown
Yeah,
that.
yeah, they're very consistent. Whether it's violence, whether it's sexuality, whether it's whatever it is, it plays a role.
Well, when I was studying stereotyping and implicit racial bias at Berkeley, one of the things that I learned was that the number of times you're exposed to a certain belief or stereotype is directly related to whether you're going to internalize that stereotype. And so repetition is a key component of social learning theory or social cognition theory, and that repetition over time, you don't have control. For example, one of the most common stereotypes is that black men are violent. And look at our news, look at the way they're portrayed in the films. And so most people, and this is from studies through the implicit association test, which came out not too long before I was studying this, most of our society hold these unfair, prejudiced views. And the repetition is why, is what I understand. It's the number of times, same thing, dumb blonde jokes. You hear them so many times. And it's really hard. They say, and the thing I found most powerful too is once a stereotype is in place, like if you watch TV for so many years,
It's hard to change.
And you've watched TV for all these years, and you've seen the Pamela Anderson sort of stereotype of a dizzy blonde. But I'm saying that's the image that's created
And
by
that
her.
stereotype is.
And in life, then you meet a blonde, and you, without realizing, it will automatically those implicit associations will come kind of flying forward, but you won't know it.
Yeah.
So it affects your judgment, your perception of people, how you treat people, and yet you're not aware of it. And so it's very dangerous, especially when it comes to the judicial system and juries and jury determinations. And that's one of the things I was going to ask you about is why there's been all this hubbub about violent video games. And of course, we are going to do a couple of shows specifically about violent video games with Craig Anderson and Brad Bushman. But what is the theory behind why video games are so much more influential than, say, radio or watching television or reading a book?
Great question. If you look at the longitudinal research on watching media violence up to, I think it's 30, 35 years in the Usman research.
Yeah.
2 factors were the best predictors. Identifying with the perpetrator, and you think it's real. Now that's in a 2-dimensional sense, watching it. Now let's think about a first-person shooter game.
Right.
You're no longer identifying, you are
Right.
the aggressor. That's number 1. So the identification part is paramount right now. It's repetitive. So I'm doing this behavior over and over and over again. Now I'm learning a certain skill, how to shoot, how to point. And if you think of traditional old-fashioned Bandurian social learning, I'm getting rewarded. So I get more points, I get more pats on the back for killing.
Right.
Okay? And it's interactive, which means it's very arousing. And one of the interesting things in social information processing is you talked about how we store these behaviors in memory. Being aroused makes it easier to sort of encode this information and in fact store. And by definition, interactive games are, as they should be, more arousing. So you have all the components that go into traditional social learning now kind of sitting there. I'm the aggressor, I'm getting rewarded, I'm repeating this over and over again. And we never had that in sort of the 2-dimensional sense. I mean, sometimes you would identify with a character because they were attractive. I mean, that was the argument. Here you are, the character. It's a much different situation.
Right. And I've read studies where, after television was introduced into a society that didn't have television, all of a sudden, the society changed. The murder rate went way up. Young women who did not describe themselves as overweight, suddenly, 20% or 15% were saying they're overweight or too big after just 2 years after television was introduced. So it's clear that the repetitive messages, the images on television, will affect someone's self-perception, perception of society.
Which is called self-schemas. So it's this kind of stereotype, if you want, of yourself.
But then the video games are even more powerful. One, because they're actually engaged in the violence and whatnot. I'm specifically talking about violent video games. But more importantly, it's the repetition. If repetition is what makes us, sort of creates a cognitive schema within our minds, and if television with the same stereotypes and racist sort of images can cause us to hold those images within our minds, and they're displayed in things like the implicit association test, which is available online, then I can only imagine how much more a video game would affect your brain, because the level of repetition is so extreme.
And it's interesting, we have no problem saying if it's a pro-social, educational, health-related video game. We would all agree. For a young adolescent, this is a great way to learn because it's repetition, you're doing it over and over again, you're getting rewarded, you're seeing this. That's traditional social learning. But again, that process of learning very pro-social, educational things is the same thing. On the negative side, you can't have it both ways.
Right.
And video games are so much fun, and they're only going to get funner as you get virtual reality going. It's hard for people to understand that they may have negative effects. I mean, people want to see the positive effects, but they don't want to acknowledge the negative effects. And gamers are like that. I mean, they are the most critical of the research because it's so much fun. And it's hard to believe that something so much fun, and that's true of media in general, that something so entertaining that makes you laugh, that makes you cry, how could it possibly have behavioral effects? That's the problem that people have in understanding media effects.
One of my concerns, though, is when I was doing the stereotype research, I read Patricia Devine's work, and she did a lot of work on how to reverse unconscious bias and stereotypes. And it's very difficult as an adult, because she says, as a child, as an adolescent, our brains are moving around a lot. They're developing, reorganizing, pruning, developing neural connections. And around whatever it is, 23, 24, somewhere in there, all of a sudden our brains become more solidified. At that point, you really almost can't change whatever's in there. And what she was doing was doing flashcards. Like, for example, you could take a photograph of a black man in a astronaut suit, or in a surgeon's blues with a stethoscope, or in a rabbi's uniform or something, to sort of start rivaling the unconscious bias that so many people in our society have. And the black male studies are among the most prominent, because that is without a doubt, one of the most problematic stereotypes in our society. But what she said was that, I mean, and this is work. As a child, it's not work. As a child, you're basically intaking information, processing it, and forming these kind of connections. But once they're formed and once your brain is solidified, you almost can't undo it. She says it takes a lot of effort.
And that, I mean, stereotypes are difficult to change. She's entirely correct, because what folks can often do is say, well, that's an outlier. This person's kind of different than my preconceived stereotype, whether it's, you know, minority groups or, you know, women and occupational roles. No, this is an outlier. So it doesn't change your overall concept. And she's quite right. Once they're there, difficult.
Well, that what concerns me about her research is, you know, apply that theory to the violent video games. You have a kid killing people every day, several hours a day, and by the time they're 23 or so, their brain is now fully formed. They're not going to change, and now they have a deeply embedded idea or concept that killing's okay. And I remember seeing one video game a while back. I walked up to my the kids' room upstairs, and we had 4 teenage boys in the house at that time, and I just sat there and watched for a minute, and my son shot a person on the video game, and the head blew up and dollar bills flew out of the neck. And I said, oh no, I get that. I get the schema being created, you know, kill people, it'll make you rich sort of thing. And I threw that one immediately in the garbage. That one was very offensive to me. Okay, so to summarize, it's really critical what goes into a child's brain between about 13 and 23, because that's when the brain is reorganizing, and whatever goes into that brain at that period is going to influence that child and basically build that child's character.
Oh yeah, and you know, we have to keep in mind, it's not even just learning of scripts. You talked about violent video games. It's also desensitization. I'm not as, which basically says I'm just not as bothered by the violence that I see. I have less empathy for victims of violence. And there's fMRI research, which in fact does show certain areas of the brain for emotion, for empathy, are not activated if you're a very heavy, you know, first-person shooter player, you know, for a certain period of time, where normally for most of us, if I see somebody injured, I have empathy, I want to do something, I want to react. Desensitization takes place, and it's something we've always known about, but it seems to be a little stronger now, particularly for interactive types of games. And again, I think it just has to do with the realistic nature of the violence.
You were talking about 13-year-olds. I think it's important to recognize that the younger you are, the more vulnerable you are. And in fact, the best violence research was done over a period of 30, 40 years and found that you learn your attitudes about violence before age 8. And once you learn those attitudes, it's very difficult to unlearn them. They're played out when you're 13, 15, 17, 24. But you learn them at a very young age. So even those, you know, crazy cartoons where, like Roadrunner that I was watching and Ed was watching when we were growing up, which was nonstop violence, those are significant. They're not as significant as watching, you know, true real life violence. But what the National Television Violence Study found was that they all contribute. Kids are watching a lot of violence, and they're learning at a very young age.
And cartoons have a lot of acts of violence.
A lot of acts of
violence. And it's sanitized,
and
right?
I
mean,
think
Roadrunner gets smashed or whatever, and it gets right back up.
And I mean, one of the real problems in the National Television Violence Study, which was this largest study done of quote unquote American television, I mean, from broadcast to cable to film, it is sanitized. So, you know, we don't see people really harmed, or it's unrealistic harm. We don't see negative consequences very, very often. Quote unquote good guys are just as violent as the quote unquote bad guys. And again, from a young child's perspective, a good guy who's attractive is somebody they identify with. Guns are used a great deal in the violence. There's no consequences to the perpetrator. Nobody says that's wrong. Nothing happens. And again, even if something happens to the person who commits aggression, if it's 2-3 scenes later, for that 4 or 5-year-old, irrelevant at that point.
So the cartoons early on are bad enough, but the difference I think is that most parents are aware that their little kids are going to be highly influenced. But I think a lot of people figure, oh, by 13 or 14, you know, they're probably already...
Actually,
the scripts are learned.
Actually, there's a new study that says that parents of young children aren't terribly worried about media, which I find incredible because that's the most vulnerable age. And I go to movies and sit and watch PG-13 and R-rated movies, and there are 5 or 6 little 4, 5, 6-year-olds sitting in the audience, and I'm thinking, what are these parents? I mean, that speaks to one of the reasons why people don't buy this,
Right.
which is what's called the third person effect. My children are smarter than to be influenced by the media. Those dumb kids down the block, oh my God, they're going to be influenced by whatever they see, but my kids won't be. They're smarter, they're different.
And it's not only the parents, there's some great new research with violent video game players, and if you ask them, does this affect you? No. Does it affect younger children? Oh yes.
Right.
Does it affect your peers? Yes, but not as much as younger children. But it doesn't affect me, and that is,
Right.
and that third person effect has just been around for a
Well, that's
long
consistent with
time.
a lot of other research showing that
Oh, yeah.
people, for example, think their own house is worth more than their neighbors when it isn't.
Yeah.
Or people think they're going to be luckier than average when they aren't, or they think they're not going to be the one to get a sexual disease,
Yeah.
whereas other people are, and it's just of course not true. But people tend to sort of see themselves through rose-colored glasses, and that's a real problem because they're not aware that they're going to be programmed just like anybody else, and there's no difference. So just to wrap it up, sort of what should parents be doing, and pediatricians and teachers too, because I think pediatricians and teachers are more likely to have access to this information. I think they should play a bigger role. So what would you suggest?
We try really hard. The American Academy of Pediatrics has been at this for a long time, and our recommendations are, and I helped to write them, avoiding screen time for babies under the age of 2, limiting total entertainment screen time, so not using the computer for homework, but entertainment to less than an hour to a day, watching with your kids and discussing the content. Just watching with your kids doesn't do anything, but you've got to discuss the content. Why is she hitting him? Why are they jumping into bed together?
And that
when
isn't
they
nice, is it? And
Right.
the counter speech. Like I would
Yeah.
sit next to my stepsons and my son, and I would say, if you were in a war like that in Call of Duty, that would not be fun. That would be your friend dying next to you, and they'd say, "Get out of here, Mom." But I would constantly, because I understand, I have to rival with my words and my nagging.
Right.
I have to rival the messages that they're getting from those video games, and I would be on them all the time, and they didn't like it. But I know that on some level, they had to think that this Call of Duty game might be fun, but if you were out there, it would not be fun at all. It's horrifying experience to be in.
And then the last recommendation, may be the most important, which is to keep technology out of the bedroom.
Yes, I've heard
because
that.
you cannot control how much time your kids are spending with TV, movies, video games, internet. If there's a computer or a TV screen in their bedroom, there are ample studies that show that kids are more likely to be obese, they're more likely to drink. There are all kinds of negative consequences to having media in the bedroom. So keep it out of there.
And ironically, in this incredibly wealthy and supposedly educated country we have, we're not teaching media effects in our schools.
No,
Other
that's
countries
right.
are. Other kids are learning in their schools that the media is going to play a big role in your life and how you develop your character. Our kids aren't getting that.
Right. No,
Our kids don't even know
as Vic
that.
said, I mean, parental mediation, co-viewing, and saying something is great. So is media literacy in the broadest sense, and we don't do it. And the interesting thing about all of that is, and there's some great research by colleagues of ours on aggression, for instance, it doesn't stop the child, let's say, from watching aggressive programming. It just gives them a vehicle of how to interpret it.
Right,
so they
exactly.
can say, no, this is wrong. This does hurt people.
Right.
This is not the way you behave at all.
Well, thank you both so much for coming. This is your host, Deana Pollard Sacks. You've been watching Meet the Professors, and we hope you'll tune in for the next show.